Good morning, everyone. We are here today with Chris Parks, and I'm super excited about this conversation. We are bringing a different perspective to our project. Of course, we'll talk to charities, we talk to NGOs, we talk to volunteers, but today we bring a photographer, and that may sound strange, but well, art and photography, it's a way to show stories. It's a way to tell stories, opening people's imagination for that. So we will talk about it, and we will talk about also some of Chris' views on racism, on the work that he's doing to make this slightly better. And I believe this will be a super exciting conversation. I'm very excited to have him on board. So, Chris, before we jump into our conversation, maybe it's not a bad idea for you to let us know who you are.
Sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. I'm Chris Parks. I'm 41. I was born English, but I was raised in South Africa from 1984 to 1993, just around the time that apartheid came to an end. And then I was finished my education and was raised in the UK after that time. And I've been working as a photographer since 2000, just before 2000. So I've been a photographer for almost 20 years now.
It's a long time. Um, one of the things that really excites me about photography is the fact that you are kind of asking the person on the other end to imagine the story behind, right? You don't necessarily have a voice telling the story. So it's a lot of interaction without necessarily having a clear one-on-one voice telling you. And that is super exciting, and I really like it, though I'm not really talented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually my first love was cinema. And I always, one of my favorite things when I was learning about movies was looking at the on-set behind the scenes photos. And those are always very sort of storytelling images. And I think I absorbed a lot of that aesthetic into my mind. And I kind of was always, that was the most exciting aspect of photography, was to be able to look at one image or a still image, but you'd automatically have some sense of what was going on. And I think I've kind of carried that through my work in some form or another since I started.
That's super interesting. But what kind of feedback do you get, right? Yeah, well, I found you via Instagram, and you have quite a significant amount of followers. Um, and you have a lot of pictures out there from all over the place. But what exactly are you trying to achieve with that? What is your goal with those pictures and those stories?
I think in the last couple of years, I've been through a big journey, but my main intent was to try and get people to be taken not just into the physical space that someone occupies. I think that's a really important part of the context of how people live. It can be about the terrain, the temperature, um, what the sky looks like, what the weather's like. So you automatically have a sense of the context that that person exists in.
Mhm.
And then what is the person doing in the image? Are they connected with the lens? Are they connected with what they're doing in that moment? Are they? I've always been very interested in people's work. Um, I'm naturally a very curious person, so I do a lot of trying, in most cases, to get a sense of um, what is the what is the physical detail, the forensic detail of that person's work, and how do I put that into the heart of the image, so all those things are coming together. And then on top of that, you'll do, where possible, you'll do an interview or a discussion with that person, so that whoever's looking at an Instagram post or a print in a gallery has a very easy access point to become interested in that person. And then you can start to nuance that story in a way that can help them understand what they're looking at or why they're looking at that image.
Where did you really start this, right? Where did this kind of passion came from? what are you trying to achieve with these stories?
I'm going to be really honest with you. At the beginning of my career, the driver was to pay my bills.
Yeah, yeah. I was about to tell you that, right? So, but I
Yeah.
assume that it don't all started by that, right? We all have to pay bills, so.
Yeah, I mean, like I just loved photography so much, and all I wanted to be was a photographer. And I like so many people, grew up with standard bearers like National Geographic, Magnum, or I worked in a bookstore, so I had access to collections of work by photographers like Don McCullen, or Annie Leibovitz, or Mary Ellen Mark, or Ellen van Unworth. And I very much wanted to produce a body of work with that kind of gravity around it.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of the last couple of years, I think I worked in London for a long time, and I was doing the kind of things that photographers do to get by. And that had become very all encompassing. And then around 2015, I had the opportunity to go to Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm.
Now, bear in mind, I grew up in South Africa during apartheid, so I have some existing connection with the continent already, albeit in a very politically complicated context and in a very racially complicated context.
Mm-hmm.
And I I was desperate to do something that reconnected me with what I had gotten into photography in the first place. And I made a charity and I volunteered for them, and it was a transformative experience. It's very much like, what have I been doing for the last 10 years? This, and not in a sense, not in a negative way. It was like, oh, this is how it was. This is what I wanted to feel when I took pictures.
Yeah.
And I went back to Sierra Leone. I went to Nepal the same year for the same charity. I then returned again the next year to Sierra Leone and Nepal again. And then I was last year. I went to a whole bunch of countries. I went to Nigeria to cover the work the charity's been doing there in the Northeast around the displacement, around the conflict that's going on there. And also did traveling through most of the southern countries in like Zambia, Lesotho, Malawi, those countries. But it's been like a bit of a journey, shall we say, coming back to this kind of photography. And I think the lens on that kind of work is really changing now.
Yeah, I'm also kind of going through that philosophical question myself, because because of these projects, it becomes harder to motivate yourself to other things in the corporate world. Not necessarily because they're not important, but because you kind of put it in a different context. When you talk to people like you, we talk to people that we have been talking in our stories, things kind of go to a different level of experience, and you start feeling that maybe those are corporate problems are a little bit less relevant to our life. But anyway, so you travel a lot, right? But you kind of still keep this relationship with Africa due to your time in South Africa, right?
Yeah, I think I don't know how many South Africans you know, or white South Africans you know. It Growing up in that time is a very particular experience, but it's also and I'll be honest with you, growing up under in this racially segregated climate. And and literally, I'm talking from when you start to have just the first beginnings of consciousness, you start to absorb what you see as given.
Yeah.
And I was I think it's hard to explain to someone that it wasn't as if apartheid was really discussed at home or at school or anywhere else. It was just that white people were here and we were well off and we had nice homes and swimming pools and good schools, and black people were over there and they were poor and they were dangerous. And that's what you grow up with. And it's nobody ever stops to explain to you that there is a system of white supremacy being politically, economically instituted by the state.
Mm.
And that didn't happen until I was, I think, 14. The first time I was really told, act by a teacher, I think, like, actually, this is a process of segregation. And because we were about to receive our first Black pupils into our school.
Mm.
And it was like this event. And I'm like, well, I was like, why is this happening? You're just a bit curious. And it's like, well, because this and this and this. And I was like, what? We do what?
Eye opener for you, huh?
Yeah. But what's interesting, and I'm sorry, just to go on a tangent, I know it was, just make no mistake, like it was profoundly damaging to those Black communities, and it forced them into economic desperation. So there was a huge increase in crime over the time I lived in South Africa, and over time, living behind bars and living in gated communities as a way of sort of protecting this institution. Even though apartheid had ended, it hasn't really ended.
Mm.
There was this huge increase in crime, and of course white communities sort of pulled in behind these gated communities, and everything's barred, and you've got 2 wire fences around this collection of very nice suburban homes. But it's not like people walked around with white hoods over their faces and chanting,
Mm.
white supremacy. And what was interesting is I came to the UK, and we moved to a very rural part of the UK when we came back in 1993. And I was really shocked to hear people use racial epithets, because that was not acceptable. The dichotomy of that experience was that not acceptable to use those words growing up. But it was acceptable to put those people, deny them every other legal and financial economic status that most people would take for granted. And I started to, I think I was interested that these people were like, oh, you're from South Africa, like that country's really racist. I'm like, in my head, I'm like, but yeah, so are you. Like,
By the
this
way.
isn't, yes, yeah, this isn't, and it's an exclusive, this isn't as exclusive to one particular group of people. And I think what's interesting, what we're seeing now, is that with what the internet has given a platform to all kinds of minorities on the left and the right, from all different walks of life they didn't have before. And what's interesting is that I think the way that white people deal with racism is that they put it's not, I'm not racist, like Nazis are racist or the KKK is racist. And there is this counter voice very much coming from the continent, from Black academia,
Mm-hmm.
and they're saying, we want to talk about institutional racism. And we want to talk about how that affects the existence, the day-to-day existence, macro and microaggressions towards people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is when you start to try and have those conversations with other white people, the reaction is almost always confusion, denial, outrage, anger, and it's kind of, they don't see it as they don't see themselves as being a part of an institution. I think growing up in South Africa gave me a sense of what it's like to be part of a very openly institutionally racist system.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here in the UK, it's not as obvious.
Yeah, but just for people to understand, right? Because you mentioned institutional racism, and I'm not expert, but I'm assuming that this is the racism that we are somehow creating by naturally having some attitudes and some behaviors that we believe are for a greater cause or for something good, but at the end are just creating this discrimination naturally.
Absolutely. And of course, as white people, we're raised to be kind and tolerant and accepting. And there's no way that, that's not me. I'm not part of that system. But it's like, you don't understand that, like me, all you have to be told is it's just there ingrained into your everyday existence. So it's not always obvious and easy to see. And it also, I think you're almost raised that to be racist is one of the worst things that you can be. It's a really difficult concept to take on board, that we're all sort of perpetuating a system that actively oppresses, marginalizes people who are other. And I think, there are many different strands of that. We can talk about LGBT, we can talk about gender, but I think the discussion around race and racism and institutional racism, I think I'm very focused on the moment because I started to realize that it was a thread that was in myself, and that it was a thread in the work that I had been doing in the last 2 years.
But just a quick reflection is, in my opinion, there is a business behind all of this, right? Or let's say business is not the right word. There is a system behind all of this, and while a lot of people helps because they really want to help, and they are probably creating this this feeling that the communities in Africa, they are hopeless and voiceless and stuff like that. But there is a good cause in their heart. They have the heart in the right place. There is still a lot of people and a lot of organizations that are not really doing much to help. What they're trying to do is to promote their brands, to make a selfie, to get likes on Instagram, and that is just feeding this entire system. And that maybe it's a place where we have to start. Is what is really helping, and what is and who is really helping, right? Are we helping the communities, or are we helping the people that is just self-promoting? Anyway, when we were preparing this, you mentioned to me that you are kind of doing a career shift, or kind of going in a different direction, let's say. So do you think is relevant for us to talk about it? Because I think is indeed, and it's very linked to what we have been just talking now, right?
Yeah, of course. So, out of the work I was doing, and just sort of to go, to thread back into your point for a minute before I sort of answer your question, in my discussions with people that I met within the sector, and I think people want to understand that the NGO and charity sector are very largely dominated by white people. It's not a diverse sector, and more to the point, those people come from quite a specific economic strata. You will very rarely get working class people in those sectors in positions of leadership or decision making.
Correct.
On the ground, it's a different story. And that's where the sort of exciting changes started to happen. But I started to realize, like you say, there's a built-in assumption we grow up with that our work is morally correct, that it's the right thing to do, that we're helping, and there's very little challenge or critique that the work we're doing might be it is perpetuating very unhelpful and harmful ideas that these people are helpless, that they have no agency, that they can't tell their own story, that they're voiceless. And rather than saying, well, what are we doing? What isn't what we're doing actually perpetuating those very ideas? And I think even on another level, it perpetuates those ideas about those people within themselves. I'd like to take, like, Sierra Leone's a really great example, because there has been a very active NGO presence in Sierra Leone, which is was a country. We had a draw. It was two tribal lands had a border drawn around it by the British Empire, and they said, right, this is where we can send our freed slaves. So there's already something very interesting about how that decision be made about that country. And then the NGO presence perpetuates a culture of dependency. And it's very much that white people come to help, and those people start to internalize the idea that they are helpless and that white people are the only solution. And that's an extreme example, but it happens on that level subtly and across the continent. So I started to have very painful, I'll be honest, and necessary period of asking myself, what am I actually doing here? What am I actually perpetuating in my work? And if I'm not comfortable, if I'm not okay with those things, how do I make sure that I'm part of a system of change, of positive change, rather than carrying on? Because believe me, it's very exciting to carry on. It's very exciting when your work is getting likes and shares, and because of how we're raised to think about it, people are like, oh my God, like, this is so amazing. Like, you putting a spotlight on these people. You're such a good person. Your work's so important. And initially, like, oh yeah, like, man, like, oh, this is what I wanted to hear all the time. This is so validating.
It's
And
crazy.
2 years later, yeah, and 2 years later, like, oh my days, like, what? Even with the best intentions, I really try to portray the people I photograph with a massive sense of power. But it's still me telling the story, not them.
Yeah.
So one of the things I start to work with the charity, is to say, right, let's not send white international volunteers into these positions where they become the photographers, the people doing the interviews. Let's start looking at how we can find local artists, local photographers. If they need a bit of support, then we can, and if they want that support and we're qualified to give it, that's one thing. But let's vacate the space, let's step out and start bringing them in, because they understand their culture, they understand the language, they understand the context deeper than anybody who is coming in as an outsider, right?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think, it's kind of right. What problems are we got here in my own country, in my own home, where I am not, and it's not an easy word to say, where I'm not really exploiting other people for, I don't want to say my own gain, because that truly, I can look at myself and see that was not my intent. But there's no matter how you split it, there's an element of exploitation there. So what can I focus on here at home? And I think that has been a kind of a 360-degree journey, coming back and realizing, I mean, that it's a different discussion about the kind of problems the UK is experiencing at the moment, but I don't think they're necessarily unique to the
No.
UK.
It's getting bigger and bigger, by the way.
Yeah, and I think every country is going through, it's almost like I'm saying, I think I look at how reactionary the extreme left and extreme right are in politics, and I kind of feel like this is what happens, because growing up in the 90s, even the early 2000s, it was kind of a single issue problem year by year. There was this and you could focus on this, and now it's more like every single possible alarm is going off and people are terrified and angry and scared, and they're finding it really hard to not be overwhelmed by how many problems there are, all going off at once. So I mean, that's kind of like where I'm going with the next step. And I think, like a lot of people, I felt very overwhelmed, and which dumpster fire would you like to put out today? Because there are 7. And I was like, well, you can't put out 7. You can only help with 1. So pick 1, start there, and start the work there, type of sort of approach.